There we go.
Testing, 1, 2, 3, testing. Yep. Testing, 1, 2, 3, Mr. Chairman. Testing, testing. No, testing. And is a button in or out? Okay, then push a button in and see what happens. Testing, testing. Okay, well, then bring your sound up a little bit. One or the other. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, good.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. The subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank you all for joining us here today to discuss 6 pieces of legislation pending before the subcommittee with the intentions of benefiting the lives of our service members, veterans, and their families. The bills brought forth by our colleagues today would address employment protections for our Guard and Reserve service members, improve transparency of the relocation of senior executives within the VA, as well as any bonuses provided to high-level VA employees. And it would also provide needed residency protections for the spouses of our active duty service members. I will let our colleagues who introduced these pieces of legislation discuss their bills in greater detail, but I do want to briefly discuss the 2 draft bills on the agenda today that have not yet been introduced. The first would modernize the appraisal process for the VA-backed home loans, something we discussed in great detail a couple of months ago at a subcommittee hearing on the appraisal process, where Chairman Greg Walden also joined us after he had been faced with a related issue in his own district. This draft bill would allow VA to utilize new technology, including desktop appraisals. This means that a VA-approved appraiser could make an appraisal based solely off of the information gathered by an approved third-party entity. I believe this change will make this appraisal process quicker and more efficient for many veteran homebuyers, and it would also save money for taxpayers. Making this appraisal process and the overall home buying process as seamless as possible for veterans and their families has been of importance to both the ranking member and myself, and I look forward to today's discussion on the draft bill that would hopefully improve this process. Now, last draft bill would improve home adaptations for qualifying disabled veterans. Currently, if a disabled veteran in the VOC rehab program needs adaptations made to their home to make their home more accessible for their day-to-day needs because of the limitations of their disability, then it is the VOC rehab counselor who has no experience or very little experience in training in home construction makes arrangements for those adaptations or finds an individual to do so who they believe is qualified to make them. While these folks are master's level counselors who provide great service to our veterans, it should not be their job to also understand how to build a ramp or affix a grab bar to the wall. This draft bill, therefore, would allow the employees from the VA Specially Adapted Housing Program who deal with this kind of construction on a daily basis to step in and take care of the veterans' adaptations to their homes. This will help our disabled veterans immensely by ensuring that they have the right people on the job so that their homes adequately address their service-connected disabilities and their needs. I believe this is a common sense change for everyone involved, and the department has even stated in their written testimony that it would save the government money. Before I yield to the ranking member, I do want to say that I'm a little disappointed that the Department of Defense declined our invitation to attend today's hearing and provide their views on H.R. 282, the Military Residency Choice Act, and H.R. 2631, the Justice for Service Members Act. Just in the bill's titles, I think it's clear to everyone that these proposed policy changes would directly affect DOD and the men and women who serve this country as well as their families. So I do appreciate the department submitted comments for the record for these bills yesterday afternoon, and while I also understand this week has been hectic with markups, it would have been valuable, I think, to have them here to answer questions. With that being said, I'm eager to discuss each of the 6 pieces of legislation before us today. I'm grateful to my colleagues who have introduced these bills and to our witnesses for being here to discuss them. I look forward to a productive and meaningful discussion, and now I'm going to yield to my friend and fellow Texan, our ranking member, Mr. O'Rourke, for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our colleagues who've come to join us today to testify on their bills, 2 of whom joined Mr. Banks and Dr. Wenstrup and I on the House Armed Services Committee defense bill markup last night that finished in a record 14 hours. So I want to thank the 2 chairs who are here who worked on that. And on this issue of compelling the Department of Defense to work more closely with the House Veterans Affairs Committee, given that we have a shared interest in what we're doing for our service members and at the time that they transition into civilian and veteran life, look forward to working with our colleagues to do that, because I think it's critical that these 2 committees work more closely together. And in anticipation and interest for what our colleagues have to say, I'll limit my opening remarks and yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. And it is an honor to be joined by our colleagues, Ms. Elise Stefanik and Mr. Robert Whitman of Virginia, Ms. Stefanik of New York, and the gentlelady from New York, Claudia Tenney, and Mr. David Cecily, the gentleman from Rhode Island, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott Taylor, at our witness table today. Thank you all for being here. And now I'm going to recognize each of you for 5 minutes. We'll start with Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke, for the opportunity to testify today before the Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on Economic Opportunity. I would like to first commend the work of this subcommittee in improving education, employment opportunities, and housing programs for veterans, as well as assisting service members with civil relief. I would also like to thank my colleague to my left, Mr. Whitman, who joins me today in testifying before the subcommittee in support of the Military Residency Choice Act. I know both he and I have the highest respect for military families and have focused our legislative efforts on supporting their cause. Military families make great sacrifices for the protection of our nation and the safeguarding of our freedom, and I feel it is my duty as a Congresswoman to help ease the burdens that they face. I proudly represent two of our nation's premier military installations, Fort Drum, home of the 10th Mountain Division, the most deployed unit in the U.S. Army since 9/11, and the Kesselring site, a Navy nuclear training facility. In addition, my home district, New York's 21st District, is home to more veterans than any other congressional district within the state. This has given me the opportunity to get to know the many military families within my district and grow familiar with the unique hardships and challenges they face. For instance, military families must relocate every few years due to their spouse's responsibility to meet the requirements of the military. They sacrifice a great deal during these relocations, uprooting their lives and disrupting their families, all while remaining committed to their duty as the spouse of a service member and serving as the critical support system for their loved ones. This is often a very difficult and challenging time, with the heaviest burden falling upon military spouses. I have introduced several bills that target the strain our military spouses face, especially during times of deployment and relocation. And today, I would like to highlight H.R. 282, the Military Residency Choice Act. Current law allows active duty service members to maintain one state of legal residence for tax and voting purposes, even when service members receive military orders requiring them to relocate. Under this law, spouses are only granted the same benefit if the service member and spouse have established the same tax residence at the time of their marriage. Essentially, this requires spouses to establish residency every time the service member receives orders with assignment to a new location, adding undue stress and anxiety to military families already under the pressure of managing their relocation. H.R. 282, the Military Residency Choice Act, will give military spouses the choice to establish the same state of residency as the service member, giving them the benefit of keeping the same state of residency for voting and tax purposes. Military spouses serve too, and this piece of legislation eliminates the daunting task of documenting multiple tax jurisdictions, which at times causes some spouses to forego the complication of working altogether. According to a recent study commissioned by the nonprofit group Blue Star Families, military spousal unemployment could cost the United States up to $1 billion a year in the loss of federal income tax, the cost of unemployment benefits, and the cost of health care issues related to unemployment. This common sense legislation will make this easier for military spouses to work and help reduce instances of military spousal unemployment. Through my constituents, I have listened to the sacrifices our military families make to keep our nation safe. We have a solemn duty to reduce the burden they face while they are fulfilling their duty to our nation. I want to thank Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke again for their leadership of this subcommittee and for the opportunity to speak today. I would now like to yield to my friend and colleague Rob Whitman from Virginia, who also deeply understands the sacrifices our military families make and has championed this issue.
Mr. Whitman, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, thank you so much. Members of the committee, thanks so much for having us here today. I want to thank my colleague, too, Ms. Stefanik, for her efforts along these lines. These indeed are extraordinarily important issues for military families, and Ms. Stefanik lays it out perfectly as to the bureaucratic maze that spouses have to navigate that their military members don't. You know, a military member can declare state of residency and it stays there, but that's not where they stay physically. They have to move around based on their assignments, and when they move around, the spouse is now required under the Military Spouse Residency Relief Act of 2009 to now redeclare residency. So that means new driver's license, new voter registration card, new tax filings, all those things that make it extraordinarily difficult on the family. And some families, depending on the spouse's military occupational specialty, may find themselves relocating several times, sometimes as much as 3 times within a single year, which makes it even more impossible for them to be able to track this and be able to be eligible for the benefits under the 2009 Act. This clearly says, let's simplify that. Let's make sure that at any time that they can declare residency in the same state as their spouse, who is allowed to do that under the current law, and that way they don't have to worry about chasing around paperwork in order to continue qualification. It just makes sense. As Ms. Stefanik pointed out, there's a number of studies out there that point to the impact that this has on spouses. It makes it more difficult for them to be employed. A RAND report points out that for military spouses, the unemployment rate is about 12%, compared to 7% for comparable civilian spouses. So we see the difference. This creates a greater level of difficulty. The important part of this, too, is it doesn't create any additional burdens on states or localities as far as how they deal with either administratively driver's licenses or tax collections, whatever it may be. So the impact on states and localities is not there. So this should be a simple, straightforward opportunity for us to correct what I'm sure was an unintended consequence of the 2009 piece of legislation, and really do what's best for our military families, for what they're doing to sacrifice, and make sure that their spouses, along with their families, can continue along as a family. Sometimes, you know, families will stay behind because of the administrative burdens that this creates. This lets families together travel and serve our nation. And, you know, we have an obligation in this nation to make sure that we are supporting not only our members of the military, but also their families, because we know, as the saying goes, you recruit soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and Coast Guardsmen, but you retain families. If we're going to retain the best and brightest, we have to make sure we're doing everything we can for their families. This bill goes in extraordinarily long ways to do that. And again, I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Stefanik, for the great job that she has done. And she and I both jointly want to see this legislation pass. So again, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the time today. Thank you to the members of the committee. Ranking Member O'Rourke, thank you. And we stand by willing, ready, and able to do what's necessary to get this legislation through.
Thank you guys so much, Ms. Stefanik, Mr. Whitman. I'm going to now recognize Ms. Tenney for 5 minutes.
Thank you, This bill would simply require the VA to submit a report to Congress at the end of each fiscal year listing the bonuses that were awarded to senior level executives within the department. In 2015, VA employees received more than $177 million in bonuses, which was 24% more than they received in 2014. The average bonus for a senior executive was $10,000. I have no doubt that the men and women of the VA serve our veterans admirably each day. In fact, I know that many of them do, and I know many of them in my district. I've spoken with veterans who are grateful for the compassionate care they receive from the VA hospital in Syracuse, as well as local VA clinics, now in Binghamton and also in Rome, New York. VA employees should be fairly compensated for their work and awarded for their achievements in service to our veterans. It is also clear to me that there's more work to be done. Just recently, an audit of several VA facilities in North Carolina and Virginia revealed that wait times continue to be misrepresented and that nearly 14,000 veterans were denied access to timely care. The audit also found that veterans are waiting an average of 26 days to see mental health specialists, while the VA falsely reported average wait times of 6 days. In light of such news, the American people are right to wonder who at the VA may be receiving a bonus this year. They are also right to be concerned about the nature and conditions of such bonuses. H.R. 1690 would add a simple reporting requirement to existing law that will streamline the oversight of bonuses at the VA. It requires the agency to proactively provide information to Congress that details the amount of each bonus awarded to senior executives, as well as the job titles of individuals and the location of their employment. Given the patterns of mismanagement at the VA, veterans must know how bonuses are being awarded at the agency, and Congress deserves to receive this information in a timely manner as possible without having to request it each year. This bill increases transparency over the bonus process without placing an undue burden on the agency. This bill was previously passed as an amendment to the House-passed VA Accountability First Act of 2017, and I remain hopeful that with the continued support of this committee and many members who are here, we will be able to move this legislation forward this year. It's an honor to represent a district that is home to more than 55,000 veterans and the former Rome Air Force Base, known as Griffiths Air Force Base. We owe it to each of them to make sure that the VA is accountable and transparent. This is why I voted for the Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, which President Trump signed into law just last week. And this is why I encourage my colleagues to support the VA Bonus Transparency Act. And I once again want to thank Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke for giving me this opportunity to testify this afternoon, and for your ongoing and bipartisan commitment to providing to our many very worthy veterans throughout our nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Tenney, and thank you for your support of the VA Accountability Act and for your testimony. And now I'm going to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke and distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today on H.R. 2631, the Justice for Service Members Act, bipartisan legislation to protect the rights of our men and women in uniform. I'd like to begin my testimony by thanking the veterans and service members who are here today, not only for their presence, but for the extraordinary service to our country. I'd also like to thank my colleagues who are original co-sponsors of this bill, including Representatives Joe Wilson, Jackie Walorski, Walter Jones, and Ranking Member Tim Walz for their support. Our veterans and their families have sacrificed much in service to our country, and the fundamental idea that we are a nation of laws and institutions that guarantee the rights of every American and ensure their access to justice. We're a stronger nation because of these rights, which includes the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, or USERRA. This law guarantees veterans and service members, including the Reserves and National Guard, the right to be free from discrimination in the workplace on the basis of their military service. Enacted in 1994 following the Persian Gulf War, Congress intended USERRA to serve as a bulwark against the exploitation of veterans and service members in the public and private workplace. But too often, veterans and service members are unable to enforce these rights under USERRA in court because of the increased use of forced arbitration in employment contracts. Often buried in the fine print of employment contracts and presented as a condition for employment, these clauses waive the rights of veterans and service members to a day in court before a dispute even arises. As the Military Coalition, a consortium of military service organizations representing more than 5.5 million current and former service members, explains, these clauses block access to the justice system and funnel service members' employment discrimination or wrongful termination, USERRA claims, into private, costly arbitration systems set up by the same employers. For example, Kevin Zobier was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy Reserves who has served since 2008. In the fall of 2002, he was called into active duty for a one-year deployment in Afghanistan. Kevin notified his employer of his deployment while also conveying his desire to resume work upon his return. On Kevin's last day of work before his deployment, his employer and colleagues threw a farewell party attended by dozens of his colleagues and the company's CEO. They gave Kevin a cake decorated with an American flag along with balloons, cards, and a gift. Just a few hours later, Kevin was fired on the basis of his deployment. In April 2014, Kevin returned to civilian life and attempted to file a suit in federal court alleging that his former employer had violated USERRA. But his company forced his claim into arbitration, citing an arbitration clause in Kevin's employment contract that he was required to sign for employment at the company, waiving his constitutional right to a jury trial. Make no mistake, this result was never intended by Congress. USERRA includes a robust protection against the waiver of rights by prohibiting the enforcement of any contract, and I quote, that reduces, limits, or eliminates in any manner any right or benefit established by USERRA. but the judicial aggrandizement of the Federal Arbitration Act of 1925, a law that was never intended to apply to employment contracts that violate federal law, has upended these protections. Along with several of my Republican colleagues and Ranking Member Walz, I filed an amicus brief in support of Kevin's petition in the Supreme Court to review this case. The Supreme Court did not grant cert to this petition, underscoring the need for Congress to act. The ball is now in our court. For over a decade, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, the Defense Department has warned Congress about the effects of forced arbitration in contracts with service members. In a 2006 report to Congress, the Department advised Congress to, and I quote, prohibit provisions in loan contracts that require service members and family members to waive their rights to take legal action, end quote. Importantly, this report was clear that waiver is not a matter of choice in take-it-or-leave-it contracts of adhesion, end quote. Since then, the Pentagon has prohibited the use of forced arbitration agreements in certain financial service contracts, recognizing that unscrupulous conduct was undermining military readiness and service members' access to relief in court. It's time to follow suit by prohibiting forced arbitration in veterans and service members' employment contracts through passage of the Justice for Service Members Act. There is broad bipartisan support for this legislation. Over 25 military organizations, including the Military Order of the Purple Heart, the National Military Family Association, Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the Reserve Officers Association, support this legislation. The Justice Department's Service Member and Veterans Affairs Initiative stated in support of this bill last Congress that USERRA gives service members the right to enforce their rights under USERRA in federal court and to request legal representation from the Department of Justice. If service members are forced into arbitration through one-sided employment agreements, these rights would be jeopardized, end quote. The Assistant Secretary for Veterans Employment and Training at the U.S. Department of Labor has similarly observed that this legislation is critical, and I quote, to ensuring that USERRA operates to safeguard both substantive and procedural rights and benefits from reduction, limitation, or elimination. Since the Second World War, Congress has expanded and strengthened the rights and protections for veterans in the workforce out of a sense of obligation that we must honor and protect our men and women in uniform. As a nation devoted to protecting American service members and their families from unscrupulous conduct, we must draw upon the strength of our laws to ensure that their rights are enforceable in courts to hold unlawful conduct accountable. In closing, I thank the subcommittee for its consideration of the Justice for Service Members Act, and I look forward to working with the members of the committee, with each of you, on protecting the rights of our nation's veterans. And I thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Appreciate your remarks. And now for my fellow freshman and former Navy SEAL, we appreciate your service, Scott. Mr. Taylor, you've got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Arrington and Ranking Member O'Rourke and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify to you today about an important matter. I proudly represent the fastest growing area in the country for veterans of the OIF, OEF conflicts, as well as women veterans as well. During a recent visit to the Hampton VA Medical Center near my district, I learned that the center's end-of-the-year hospital star rating for fiscal year 2016 was increased from a 1-star to a 2 stars out of a 5-star rating. It was also on that visit that I learned that the director that oversaw the center during its 1-star rated period was simply transferred to a different center, meaning that a poor performer was transferred to another one without any accountability. Further, taxpayer dollars paid for the reassignment cost. We should never defend mediocrity, and our veterans certainly deserve the best health care and a lot more. We should expect nothing less than excellence from our VA administrators. And this bill aims to bring much-needed oversight and accountability to ensure just that. The VA Senior Executive Accountability, or SEA Act, would require the VA to submit semi-annual reports to Congress outlining all instances of senior executive transfers within the department during the period covered by the report. Each report will describe the purpose and each reassignment and the costs associated with such reassignment. The bill would also require the Secretary of Veteran Affairs to personally sign off on all transfers of senior executives. Reports shall be submitted to Congress no later than June 30th or December 31st of each year. A version of this language was offered as an amendment to H.R. 1259, the VA Accountability First Act of 2017. It was well received in a very bipartisan manner on a voice vote on March 16th. And these provisions are in line with Secretary Shulkin's own calls for increased accountability at the VA. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and I think I can speak on behalf of the subcommittee when I say thank you all for your passion and your commitment and engagement in this process and for service to our veterans. So very thoughtful pieces of legislation for us to consider. I look forward to giving strong consideration to each one of your policy proposals as we move it through the process. Now, unless there are any questions from my colleagues, I think I will just excuse you all and we'll have our next set of panelists. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Especially members of Congress, but all of them. I want to send a thank you note from them to them, and I'll sign it, and I'll just put a handwritten note. You'll know what you mean when I say that. Okay. Okay, now I want to recognize our second panel of witnesses today. I want to welcome back Mr. Kurt Coy, Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Opportunity at the Department of Veterans Affairs, who's accompanied by Ms. Tia Butler, Executive Director of the Corporate Senior Executive Management Office of HR&A, and Mr. Jeff London, Director of VA's Loan Guarantee Service. Also, want to welcome Major General Jeff Phillips, Executive Director of the Reserve Officers Association, and Mr. Gabriel Stultz, Legislative Counsel of the Paralyzed Veterans of America. Again, thank you all for coming and joining us today, and I'm going to recognize each of you for 5 minutes. We'll start with you, Mr. Coy.
Good afternoon, Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss legislation pertaining to the Department of Veterans Affairs. As this is my first hearing with you as Chairman of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, I would like to thank you for your leadership and passionate interest in our nation's veterans. And if I may, I would also like to compliment the committee staff for their professionalism, hard work, and complementary passion to assist veterans. Accompanying me today is Tia Butler, Executive Director of Corporate Senior Executive Management Office, and Jeff London, Director of the VA Loan Guarantee Program. There are a few bills under discussion today that would affect programs or laws administered by other agencies. We respectfully defer to those agencies for comment. H.R. 1690 would require VA to submit an annual report to Congress regarding performance awards and bonuses awarded to high-level and executive employees at VA. VA would be required to submit this report no later than 30 days after the end of the fiscal year. VA supports this requirement, but would suggest that the report be submitted no later than 120 days after the fiscal year. This time frame would allow us to complete the necessary statutory requirements of the SES performance management. H.R. 2772 would prohibit the reassignment of VA senior executive employees to similar positions within the department without written approval by the Secretary. It would require the VA to submit semi-annual reports to Congress on the reassignment of such individuals and include the purpose and costs associated with any such reassignments. VA supports the requirement that the Secretary approve the reassignment of senior executive personnel. We would recommend some revisions to narrow the focus of the report to include the cost of incentives rather than the other more routine costs associated with reassignments. An unnumbered draft bill would streamline the provision of housing modifications currently authorized under Chapter 31, known as the Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment Program, or VRE, by administering them under Chapter 21, the Specially Adapted Housing Program. It would also cap the amount of such modifications at the same amount as the Specially Adapted Housing Grant, but allow the Secretary to waive the cap if deemed necessary for rehabilitation program. VA supports this bill. Beneficiaries who qualify for benefits under SAH are able to seek out and hire contractors of their choice, whereas those who qualify for benefits under VRE are subject to VA's procurement process and have little or no control over the contractor's selection process. Additionally, VA determined the home adaptation program of the Independent Living Rehabilitation Plan would best be administered by the professionals of the SAH program who are well-versed in home construction. Another unnumbered bill would authorize VA-designated appraisers to rely on information provided by third parties when valuing properties for the VA Home Loan Program. VA also supports this bill as it would enable VA-designated appraisers to expand their coverage to areas, and it would increase the number of appraisals they could perform in a timely manner. The bill would better align VA appraisal policy and procedures, industry standards, address recent industry concerns regarding timely delivery of VA appraisal product, and likely encourage more use of the VA Home Loan Program by making VA financing more attractive within the mortgage industry. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. We would be pleased to respond to any questions you or the other members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Coy. Now, Major General Phillips, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on proposed legislation. My written testimony addresses the bills that affect National Guard and Reserve service members and their families. Today, I will focus on binding or pre-dispute arbitration and service member claims in connection with the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. This issue directly affects members of the reserve components who tend to have civilian jobs when they return from war. H.R. 2631 decisively addresses this issue and has ROA support. Former Congressman Michael Michaud, who was a member of this committee and the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Veterans Employment and Training, said, USERRA prohibits discrimination in employment based on an individual's prior service in the uniformed services, current service in the uniformed services, or intent to join the uniformed services. USERRA also guarantees that civilian employees who take military leave can return to their jobs without penalty. The Supreme Court has called this law critical to manning the armed forces. When Congress enacted USERRA, it adopted protections intended to ensure that service members would not waive any of their rights under USERRA. Congress wanted to ensure the integrity of the law's provisions. Specifically, Section 4302B of Title 38 voids any agreement, quote, that reduces, limits, or eliminates in any manner any right or benefit provided by USERRA. This section codifies anti-waiver principles that the Supreme Court established in the 1940s and 1950s to protect service members' rights. Additionally, the House report that enacted this section explained that arbitration is not required and that arbitration awards involving USERRA can't be enforced. But abuses have indeed occurred and show us that the intent of USERRA is being thwarted. We just heard about the case of Navy reservist Kevin Ziober. We think that such decisions by the court are contrary to the intent of Congress, that service members can't be forced to arbitrate their USERRA claims, that they can't be forced to weaken their USERRA rights. You may not know about Rodney Bodine, an Army reservist. Rodney was told by his supervisor that military folks don't work out at that particular place of business. His supervisor ridiculed him for performing his military duty instead of working on the weekend and pressured him to choose between the military and his civilian job. Bodine was fired for extending his contract with the military. He was fired without the employer showing cause of substandard performance. The court in 2015 enforced the arbitration agreement he'd made, and his USERRA rights were sacrificed. ROA does not per se oppose arbitration. It is when a person is compelled under the pressure of getting hired to forfeit his or her rights contrary to the spirit of the law to submit to involuntary consent that we find cause for alarm. Further, arbitration agreements silence the service member's voice by requiring confidentiality. Thus, we can't fully gauge the extent of the issue. For every Ziober, how many others never go to court, never go to the media, never go to their members of Congress? We do know that even after nearly 20 years of war and flag waving, some employers are still firing service members for serving their nation. We can only imagine the effect of these abuses on rates of depression, suicide, and other destructive behaviors within the veteran community. Without strong USERRA rights, many Guard and Reserve members literally cannot afford to serve in the military. Congress invoked its war powers when it enacted USERRA because USERRA and the associated issues are matters of national security as opposed to commerce or the workplace. Congress was clear that service members cannot be required to arbitrate their USERRA claims, but the federal courts need unequivocal language. Federal judges apparently sympathize with service members and their families, but believe the statute as written is not clear enough for them to bar forced arbitration. When the Ninth Circuit ruled against Kevin Ziober, it concluded the opinion by stating, Congress can fix this problem to make clear that it does not render pre-dispute agreements to arbitrate USERRA claims unenforceable. In this sentiment, the Ninth Circuit has been joined by other courts which have ruled similarly. Judges are stymied by unclear language. The Supreme Court has not yet stepped in, even though a group of 20 representatives and senators filed a brief in May asking the court to hear the case and rule in favor of our service members. ROA asks Congress to amend the statute to eliminate binding arbitration and protect service members from waiving their rights under USERRA. The passage into law of H.R. 2631 would help ensure that service members can serve their country and their employers without penalty. ROA urges Congress to pass this bipartisan legislation for all those patriots who serve and have served us so well and so faithfully. I thank the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee for holding this hearing and for your leadership on such key issues, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, General Phillips. Now yield or recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Stoltz.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member O'Rourke, members of the subcommittee, Paralyzed Veterans of America appreciates the opportunity to present our views on pending legislation. Forced moves between states, sometimes more than once in a given year, lead to complicated and burdensome tax situations for military personnel. The Service Members Civil Relief Act alleviated this burden by allowing them to keep one tax domicile or state of residence throughout their career. While the same benefit was eventually afforded to spouses, there's a caveat in the law that requires them to share the same domicile or residency as the service member. This requirement has led to unintended consequences in some circumstances, specifically for couples who marry after the service member has established residency elsewhere. If the spouse is unable to independently establish residency in the service member's home state, or if the service member doesn't want to change their state, perhaps because it has no income tax, the spouse is effectively precluded from this benefit. The Military Residency Choice Act would cure this issue by allowing the spouse to adopt the domicile of the service member. Given the sacrifices these families make, this is appropriate. We also support H.R. 1690 and H.R. 2772, both of which would dovetail nicely with the recent enactment of the VA Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act. These bills help address two issues that have caused people across the country to scratch their heads in frustration and ask how employees who find themselves in hot water end up getting transferred or getting a bonus instead of getting fired. Greater transparency through reporting on VA's utilization of bonuses and employee transfers will help answer these questions. With regard to H.R. 2631, the Justice for Service Members Act, Congress should be aware that last week the Supreme Court sent a clear signal that veterans and service members subjected to arbitration as part of an employment contract will not find relief in the courts when they end up not liking the forum. By deciding not to hear the case, the court is leaving in place the lower court's interpretation that USERRA does not extend protections to procedural rights. This means that if Congress intends to preclude forced arbitration of disputes arising under USERRA, it must do so in unmistakable language. Two circuit judges in separate cases went so far as to write concurring opinions expressing the importance of clearly articulating congressional intent to preclude forced arbitration in light of strong policies favoring arbitration. We support this legislation because it does just that. To be clear, this bill permits veterans and their employers to continue to utilize arbitral instead of judicial forum to resolve disputes if they so choose. We find, though, that veterans seeking protections under USERRA are doing so precisely because of the significant risk of discrimination placed upon them when forced to leave their job for months or even over a year in order to serve their country. Growing numbers of employers are turning to mandatory pre-dispute arbitration agreements, and in light of the sacrifices veterans make, it is consistent with the intent of USERRA to afford them every advantage in ensuring their rights remain protected. I'll close by addressing the draft bill that deals with a very important issue for paralyzed veterans: home modifications and adaptations. Having an accessible home is critical for service-connected, catastrophically disabled veterans seeking to reintegrate in society in a meaningful way. Currently, VA administers a number of programs designed to meet this need. This draft bill would consolidate certain redundant administrative functions within VA by shifting authority from the VOC Rehab Program to the Loan Guarantee Office to carry out home adaptations veterans are entitled to under Chapter 31. It is important that VA explore ways to better utilize resources instead of simply throwing more money at problems. Our biggest concern with this draft bill is that the expected gains in efficiency might fail to be realized if the Loan Guarantee Office isn't able to scale up in a way that corresponds with the increased workload as a result of changes. Just a year ago, our organization testified before this subcommittee calling for greater investment in staffing and expedited processing for terminally ill veterans, including those with ALS. Some of the specially adapted housing programs are operating smoothly. I just checked in with many of our service officers across the country, and they've had favorable things to say, but others still suffer from delays. Spreading staff too thin in this department could exacerbate these kind of issues, so if this bill moves forward, we would expect strong oversight. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltz. Now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Let me just follow on what Mr. Stoltz had raised with respect to concerns, resources. It seems to me to make way too much sense to allow the specially adapted housing agents, as opposed to the VOC rehab counselors, to work on these VOC rehab cases, but to your point, without resources and the fact that they've been flat in their budget over the last several years, Mr. Coy, could you address those concerns? Are you also concerned? Or do you think y'all have the capacity to manage that and serve our veterans in this respect?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest we're always concerned to make sure that we have the resources necessary to serve veterans in the way that they deserve. This particular bill would increase our workload within the SAH folks about 10%. And so we looked at that very vigorously, and we have about 173 current SAH agents across the country, and we believe that we can absorb this additional workload and not cause any delays in the housing projects that we have now.
Thank you, Mr. Coy. We had a hearing in April where, in the ranking member's experience and wisdom, directed the panelists to go back and solve the problem for us and not look to the government, believe it or not, to solve the problem. I really appreciated him making that recommendation to the committee. This had to do with the appraisal process. And Mr. London, I think you were there, and so maybe Mr. London could address this, but I'm happy for you to address it as well, Mr. Coy. What solutions have come out of that? We asked that the stakeholders come together. There's Department of Defense. We had folks from industry. What solutions have come from those discussions since April?
I know Mr. London got all the people on the panel together in the beginning of May. We discussed all of the issues. There are some pending assignments from each of the members of the panel, but I'll turn it over to Mr. London, and he can give a little bit more explicit, detailed report on some of the things that he did with the panel.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Coy. Good afternoon. We had a very productive meeting at the beginning of May with the other panelists from the appraisal hearing that we held in April. And it was about a 3.5-hour meeting where all of the stakeholders were very much engaged. And one of the key things that we discussed at the very beginning of the meeting is we wanted to come to a common understanding of what our goals are. And we came to 3 points that we believed that we needed to focus on, and that really shaped the conversation. First, we wanted to make sure that any changes or enhancements or opportunities for improvement that we came up with, that first and foremost needed to protect the veteran. We also decided that whatever the solutions we come up with, it also has to obviously take into account the taxpayer burden and make sure that we're not adding additional costs, and also the integrity of the program. And thirdly, we wanted to make sure that any changes that we decided to implement, we would still be in compliance with the uniform standards of professional appraisal practice. So again, that shaped the conversation. And so each entity had an opportunity to address concerns and also pose different ideas. And the bottom line of the discussion is one of the key things that we wanted to do, and we are currently working through this process, is as we talked about in the appraisal hearing, we wanted to make sure that in rural areas that we had adequate coverage, to make sure that we had the right number of appraisers. But of course, in rural areas, there's a lot of travel time that's needed for the appraiser. So one of the things that obviously came out of that is the desktop appraisal. So we are going to test the various desktop appraisal products against appraisals that are being done today to ensure that the integrity of that process is still there. And that will be a part of our market research as we are about to let a new appraisal contract in about a year or so. The other thing that, or action that
Mr.
came
London,
out of,
Mr. London, and just in the interest of time, and you can finish it, but let me ask on that
Absolutely.
desktop, since that's the draft legislation on the desktop appraisal
Yes, sir.
initiative. It's, I think, intuitive that it will streamline the process, not having somebody travel, but will it also reduce cost, given that the VA pays for that travel? Do you anticipate cost savings in this?
well, the appraisal fee that that is given to the appraiser in most cases does not take into account travel time. Really, what we're paying for is that appraiser's professional valuation opinion based on his or her market knowledge of the subject property and the comparables. So looking at it at first glance, I don't think that it would have an immediate cost savings because we don't currently include mileage in the appraisal fee. If there is mileage, that's an additional cost. So in that sense, it would reduce some, but not the appraisal fee itself.
With the permission of the ranking member, would you mind if he finished the, so we had desktop appraisals. Could you just finish? You said you had 3, so then I'm going to defer to the ranking member for any questions and comments.
Absolutely, and I'll be succinct for the sake of time. The second action item that came out of the meeting was about making sure that VA worked together with industry to come up with uniform training on the VA appraisal process to ensure that the new and current appraisers understand the VA requirements, because a lot of times as we discussed in April, there are misnomers about the process and people think that the VA process is more complicated than FHA or conventional appraisals. So we want to make sure that we have uniform training out there so that stakeholders know what the expectations are. And the last outcome was centered around continuing education credits. We wanted to make sure that as we worked to recruit new appraisers, that one incentive that we potentially could provide is to offer continuing education credits for those appraisers who currently are working the program and who are thinking about working in the VA program. And I know I said there were 3 things, but there actually was a 4th thing that's somewhat tied to the training aspects. Both the Appraisal Institute and NAR made the commitment that they will work with the VA to work with their members to educate them about the VA process and to hopefully recruit more appraisers.
Well, Mr. London, I just want to say thank you for taking our request seriously and for being so diligent about it, and I'm encouraged to hear some of the outcomes of your stakeholder meeting. And with that, I want to recognize the Ranking Member O'Rourke for any comments he has.
I'd just like to add to the chairman's thanks to you, Mr. London, for working with those other members of that panel following the hearing in April, and look forward to some formal presentation of the solution that comes from all the stakeholders, and ultimately is up for us to assist in whether it's authorizations that are necessary or working with the VA where they can implement these things administratively. So really grateful for the work that you're doing and looking forward to the final product on that. For Mr. Coy, I wanted to follow up on Mr. Taylor's testimony regarding the Senior Executive Accountability Bill. And I begin by saying I really am grateful for what he is trying to do, which is, if I had to boil it down, and if I were sharing this with my constituents, I'd say it's to make sure that we don't just shuffle around mediocre senior executives where after they fail in one place, they're moved to another. And he gave some pretty compelling examples of the consequences of doing that. I'd also add, and I don't think this is contained in Mr. Taylor's bill, this committee and the VA needs to find a better way of attracting the very best talent we can for these positions. And if that involves increasing pay or flexibility, or as we found in El Paso, where we waited 2 years to fill a vacant directorship, the candidate who was interested had to spend a year in the hiring process, fill out endless paperwork, write essays that were then graded and returned to him for improvement when we were desperate for leadership. And we had decided, I say we, the government, that this was our man for the position. He had decided he was willing to work for us, and we made it just about as hard as we could on him. So yes, let's get rid of unproductive, mediocre senior executives that are in the way of excellence at the VA. Let's also attract and retain the very best. Those two need to go hand in hand. Your testimony suggested that you wanted to narrow the cost language to only the costs of incentives associated with reassignment. Can you expand on that and perhaps answer what I think Mr. Taylor's interest was, and I think mine is as well? I want to know what the full cost is of shuffling people around, just in terms of what we pay out. So you know, our all-in costs on doing this.
Well, for that question, I'll turn it to my colleague, Ms. Butler, and she's been working this issue 24/7, so it's probably more appropriate that she answer that question.
Thank you, Ms. Butler.
Thank you. So to answer the first question about relocation incentives as opposed to relocation costs, the costs are no different than any other permanent change of station cost that would be incurred in any other federal agency when an employee is moved on the request of the government. So those costs are really predetermined, if you will, under the GSA contract where moves are concerned. Where we have flexibility within the VA, or where we have an option as to how we decide whether or not there would be an incentive involved, is based on whether or not the position is otherwise likely hard to be filled, absent the incentive. So that is why we were asking to make that distinction. We can certainly work with our colleagues in the financial management side of the house to find out how much we spend in entirety on relocation expenses, but with respect to incentives, it's a much smaller number, and that was why we were asking to make that distinction.
Great. And I wonder if we can't, it sounds like that distinction might be important, if we can make that distinction in the presentation of costs and still present the entirety of those costs, the incentive costs, and then what you say is a standardized set of costs when you're relocating any federal senior executive service employees. Is that, maybe to bring it back to Mr. Coy, who's presenting the VA's official response on this legislation, is that amenable to you? And could we then, if the bill were changed to reflect that, could we then get the VA's support for this?
The bill does have our support, and so we'll be happy to work with the committee to make sure that any concerns that we have and or you have or the committee does, that we'll get them resolved.
Okay. That answers my questions. I'll yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. And now I want to recognize the gentleman from Ohio, our chairman, Brad Wenstrup, for 5 minutes of comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Coy, General Phillips had talked about in 1690 the possibility of a report on bonuses, and talked about possibly a report on those that did not receive a bonus. What would be the department's feeling on that?
I'm not clear. Are we? What's the department's feeling on not giving out bonuses?
No. On having in the report those that did not receive a bonus.
I don't think the department has an issue with that, and I think I'm looking at my colleague over here, and she went, no, we officially don't have a problem with that, and we'll be happy to do that, sir.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of if there's any pros and cons, to it. I think that, speaking for myself, that I look at a bonus as something exceptional, and retaining your job is the norm. So I wouldn't want necessarily it to be viewed as, because you didn't get a bonus, that you weren't doing your job when you were doing your job. But bonuses are for going above and beyond. At least I think that's the approach we should maybe take going forward. And so I just wanted some input on that. So.
I've been a senior executive for close to 20 years. And the way we do it at the VA essentially is that if your rating is fully successful, in other words, you're doing your job, you don't qualify for a bonus. The people that qualify for bonuses are those folks that are rated outstanding and exceptional. At least I know that's the way we do it in VBA, and I think that's the way we do it across the department. My colleague here is nodding her head again, so those people that are fully successful do not get a bonus.
Yeah. General Phillips, what was your intent with that?
Dr. Wenstrup, it was to achieve a totality of information so that we could see, we're not necessarily disagreeing with how bonuses are given out or not given out, but we wanted to see if there are trends, there are indicators of problems in various geographic areas or specialty areas.
Okay. When senior executives are reassigned, as far as the secretary goes, what's the level of awareness? Do these things happen off the secretary's radar? Does the secretary sign off on that? How does that work?
I'm not intimately familiar. Most of the issues that we've heard of and has been talked about are in the world of VHA and moving hospital directors, as shown by the example. So I'll let Tia answer that very quickly.
Okay.
That's correct. Most of the examples are typically with respect to reassigning executives within VHA. But in terms of approval level, currently in the department, under this secretary and under prior secretaries, the authority to approve personnel actions where executives are concerned has been delegated to the chief of staff. I would say that the secretary is typically involved where the medical center director positions have been the primary case, if you will. And under the previous administration, the deputy secretary was very much involved because we were looking to make certain that we had many of those positions filled, and we're looking at the timeliness within which we could get them filled as well.
So it's not necessarily signed off by the secretary or deputy secretary, but they sometimes want to be involved. Would you recommend that they be involved at some level when those made aware or sign off on those moves?
I would say that we certainly would want our secretary to have the flexibility to be able to be aware, but then also to be able to delegate where he sees fit. But I do believe that, especially with many of our high-profile cases, the secretary is very much aware of what the selection is, as well as the timing and things like that.
Anyway, because they
Yes.
obviously have a keen interest in
Yes.
those particular moves. General Phillips, and thank you for that answer. You mentioned there's no such thing as voluntary consent for arbitration, and I'm not sure I understand that. If you could explain.
I was thinking that I was referring to the fact that when we include an arbitration clause in a hiring document, we are essentially involuntarily causing that person to opt into arbitration because they want the job, and they're not at the hiring table going to say, well, no, I'm not going to.
Right.
Can we take this out? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it certainly does. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and now recognize the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes of questions and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to talk about the Accountability Act that we're discussing here. We had a committee hearing in the last Congress, and after that hearing, Representative Mike Kaufman and I requested that the VA OIG review allegations that a supervisor at a VA facility in the Bronx, my home state, made unauthorized contract purchases for prosthetics totaling more than $50 million. It obviously gave the appearance that maybe there was some kind of a fraud going on. After the investigation, they showed that one of the purchase card program managers had knowingly entered inaccurate data related to the purchases, which resulted in about $500,000 worth of unauthorized purchases that could not be accounted for. So the supervising manager was at fault. He was found to be at fault for not providing adequate and required oversight, and that supervisor was removed from that particular role at the VA and then subsequently transferred to a different role at another VA facility. Now, I mean, OIG obviously acknowledged that the actions such as these obviously harm the public trust, that the VA is actually properly executing their duties. Shuffling people around doesn't do any good, and obviously this is one of the reasons why we're here talking about this today. I guess just my question to you, Mr. Coy, would be, is there, in addition to what the language that's in the bill, is there any additional information that you believe should be reported by the VA regarding reassignments of senior executives?
Thank you for the question. I think the legislation is pretty clear that you want the cause of the particular reason for the reassignment, the cost associated with it, and that senior management, most certainly the secretary, is aware and knows of it. As Ms. Butler indicated, I've had a number of interactions with the secretary, and he is a very hands-on secretary. He's aware of these things.
Okay. Ms. Butler, just to you, what you were, in terms of the cost of reassignment and all that, are there any challenges that you foresee in the ability to obtain the necessary information regarding all of the costs, regardless of what the language, if it changes, but the costs associated with reassignments as required for reporting under the bill? Any obstacles that you see?
So the relocation expenses are typically covered by our Office of Finance and the Travel Office. I do not have complete purview over that. I can say, however, though, that let's say an employee is scheduled to move and or become effective at their new duty station July 1st. They have so many days to actually execute the move, and in the process of doing that, there may be some expenses that are follow along after that. So in terms of knowing, kind of clean cut points and things like that, there may be some, I won't say challenges with it, but I think it may not be as clean cut as we all hope it might be in knowing that, well, the person is now at this location, but they may or may not have fulfilled all of their moving requirements, if you will.
So how would you address that?
So again, because this is done by, the Travel Office underneath of the Office of Finance, that's not something that's under my purview, but we can certainly work with them to make certain that they articulate what would be the best way to report it moving forward.
Okay, great, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. And now I want to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. John Rutherford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, panel, for being here this afternoon. And Ms. Butler, I'd like to ask a question concerning the bonuses and other awards that are available to personnel, senior executives particularly. Is there a list somewhere of those disqualifiers that would preclude a senior executive from receiving a bonus?
So because most of, or I would say all of the awards, bonuses are performance-based in the department, it really is potentially a different list every year based on how the employee actually performed throughout the year. This past year, as Mr. Coy stated, we actually were able to give performance awards to those executives who were rated outstanding and or exceptional. However, due to the CARE limitations that we had across the department, our funding was actually limited. So even some of our exceptional employees were not given performance awards because our awards dollars were limited.
Well, the matrices that are used to award the bonuses then, are there those that are strictly, numbers driven? We did X number of these things, or are there also issues of individual performance, showing up at work on time and those sorts of things? Or are they all just performance for the unit, or are there individual standards as well?
All of our executives are on individual performance plans. All of their results-driven critical elements are aligned to organizational goals as well. But the other elements that are very much specific to the executive are things like leading people, leading change, their business acumen, and things like that. So I would say the best way to describe it is it's a combination of all of those factors, both individual as well.
So there is a list of those somewhere?
In terms of the performance standards?
Yes.
Yes.
Could I get a copy of that?
Certainly.
I'd just be interested in seeing what's actually being measured. Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Stoltz. I'm going to switch over now to the arbitration process. Can you tell me how many instances you've observed where you think the member was negatively impacted by going through arbitration? Is that a high number, low number? Give me a feel for that.
I honestly couldn't give you an accurate number, sir.
Do you have just a gut feeling about?
Well, given the number of cases that have reached the circuit and been disposed of, one making it all the way to the Supreme Court, there's obviously a number of service members that have been negatively affected to the point where they've taken it that far.
Could I ask all the panel just very briefly, yes or no? Do you support the language in 2631 dealing with the arbitration?
Sir, ROA supports it. Reserve Officers Association supports it.
Thank you. I wasn't here earlier.
We support it as well.
Okay. Okay. And so, yeah, you hear those that are saying, well, this is just, trial lawyers trying to get into the system deeper. Is that, you obviously don't agree with that?
Quite frankly, sir, this allows the service member to choose. And so arbitration is still available to be fully employed. These are in the instances where somebody feels like the cards are really stacked against them, where they've been treated in a way that arbitration just isn't going to satisfy them. So I don't live in fear of trial lawyers taking all the money away because now they're going to use litigation. Nothing is forcing you into litigation in this bill.
I concur. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I'm going to yield some time for more questions for my colleagues if they have any, and if not, I'd like to follow up with just a few questions. Mr. Stoltz, just following on Mr. Rutherford's line of questions regarding H.R. 2631, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Sometimes I feel like we've got solutions looking for a problem here. Why does the service member need to have an exception here under USERRA and be precluded from these arbitration provisions and these employment contracts? And then I want to talk about maybe some adverse unintended consequences to that. But what's the problem?
Well, I'd say the problem is, like I said, there are circumstances where I'm a returning service member, maybe I'm a private first class, I have a high school education, and I don't have the resources to go stack up the lawyers and take on Circuit City. Circuit City is one of the seminal cases on this issue. They obviously have a wide variety of resources at their disposal. When you sign the contract of adhesion, essentially is what it's called, when you sign up for employment, you don't realize that you've just elected to travel to wherever it is they said they want arbitration to take place. Sometimes you have those kind of clauses in there where you essentially say, if I want to fight this, I've got to figure out a way to get somewhere and live there until this arbitration is resolved. So my question is, what is the harm in having a very tiny population of service members have this choice when it comes to how they litigate a form of discrimination against them? And if it's such a pervasive problem, if it's a wider population, you need to start asking why service members are being discriminated against at such a large scale.
It seems to me that if it was a problem for the service member, it'd be a problem for civilians, for all Americans, right? I mean,
no, I would.
Or is that not the case? I mean, educate me on it. It's more of a question.
The only distinction that I would offer you is there's not a lot of civilians out there that say that somebody just made me take a 12-month break. And by the way, I might need some lead-up time to that. And when I come back, you're going to give me my full job back. You know, I used to work for a government agency as a prosecutor in Sarasota, Florida. They can absorb me back in, but if I'm at a mom-and-pop business, that puts them under serious strain. So there is a much higher propensity for discrimination against people who are going to interrupt a business flow to that degree.
I think that's a great point. and one I haven't thought of. So I'm going to take that into consideration. Thank you for that. Do you think there's a chance, and I guess there's always a chance, but we've got to weigh the pros and cons here, so there might be the unintended consequence of veterans not being hired because they have this exception. So from the outset, it might, not veterans, service members rather. Do you think there's a probability, what level of probability you think that could happen? Seems realistic to me that it could happen.
I disagree. I think there is such a movement now to address veterans' unemployment because it is higher. It already is higher regardless. And there is such a movement to expose the skills that me and the others that have served bring to the job environment that I think, you know, I'll use Circuit City again just because they were one of the cases. So, yeah. The fact that they would forego hiring a select number of veterans simply because this clause wouldn't apply to them, I think would be a very small thing for them to absorb.
Okay. Your first point, I agree with that one. I'm not sure I do, but I wouldn't want it to happen. I would say that. I would not want that. I don't think anybody would, so I worry about it, though. Last comment / question on the bonuses. You know, I have no problem with rewarding excellent behavior and performance, and I think that's the best practice in the best organizations. But you've got to be able to use the other tools to hold folks accountable and remove poor performers, and that's the culture we all want at the VA. I'm sure it's the culture you want at the VA. I'm not as interested in seeing who gets them and who doesn't get them. I'm interested in what Mr. Rutherford talked about, and that's goals, strategic goals, performance, key performance indicators. Are you delivering the service, the product? Are you serving the customer, the taxpayer, in managing and stewarding resources? Are you serving the customer and the veteran and delivering quality and timely service? That, to me, that as a committee, we ought to be looking at that level of strategy and policy making. And if you're not meeting those goals, then we shouldn't reward you all. We shouldn't reward the secretary. And that's how it ought to be all the way through the organization, because then we don't have to focus on process all the time. To me, process takes care of itself if you hold people accountable for the results. And so I would be really interested at some point in seeing some of these key performance, these metrics at the various divisions and departments at the VA. I'm going to be looking at that as we move forward, but to me, that is what we ought to be thinking about and focusing on. Any comments about that?
I would agree, sir. As I indicated before, I have lots of gray hair and been around too long, way too long, probably. I will tell you my performance plan right now is about 15 pages long. And as Tia indicated, there's pretty much two aspects to it. One are the numbers. For example, I have a timeliness requirement for contacting veterans for their SAH grants within 30 days. I've also passed that on to Mr. London, and so if he doesn't make his goal, I don't make my goal.
That's right.
And so we have come a long way in VA. It's going further and further, and so my only comment would be is at some point, are you saturated with? If he doesn't make his timeliness goals because the phone system went down for 6 months, do I hold him accountable for the same goal? And so there's also needs to be a little bit of mitigating circumstances there. But I would suggest that VA is very much on the right track, and I would suggest that my colleague, Ms. Butler, would probably indicate that as well. She does it full-time, 24/7.
Yes, that's true. And I would also say that part of the reason why we asked for more than 30 days to be able to respond is because one of the statutory requirements is the Performance Review Board, where we have a board of other senior executives who are reviewing the performance appraisals, the ratings from their supervisor, the executive's self-assessment against the benchmark criteria to indeed say or evaluate whether or not they have met the mark and whether or not they've met the mark across the board. And those executives that are participating on that panel participate for about 2 weeks in order to review the nearly 500 performance appraisals for all of the executives across the VA. So we do indeed have a very rigorous process in terms of evaluating executive performance at the end of the year. And we'd be more than happy to share the results of that.
Terrific. Well, I appreciate, yes, last call for comments and questions. Mr. Rutherford.
Just very quickly, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on what Mr. Stoltz said and highlight the fact that all the parties have to consent to this arbitration. So those employers, I think he's probably right, are not going to be put off by a process that they have to agree to, right?
My understanding is this would change it so that parties would agree after the disputes arisen as opposed to at the beginning of employment.
Okay.
So yes,
Yeah.
I agree.
And I just remembered I had this on my phone. Because I know we bring a lot of problems to you guys, and I just want to mention this. A veteran in Jacksonville sent me this just this morning. It's a picture of a valet parking for our handicapped people at the Jefferson Street VA clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. He said, "This is what greeted me this morning." He didn't know that this program started about a month ago, a couple months ago maybe. And then it says, 8 a.m. appointment this a.m. They called me to see the doctor at 7:58. So things are working well at that clinic. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford, and for that clarification. I'm just getting all kinds of good counsel from you guys. This has been a great discussion from my perspective, and I really appreciate your time. Ms. Rice, any further comments or questions? Really appreciate you guys hanging in there with us, and this is very important. I think some great proposals for us to consider. Mr. London, again, thanks for following up and doing what we asked you to do. With that, I want to again thank everybody for coming, and want to announce that the subcommittee is tentatively scheduled to hold a markup on some or all of these bills on July 12th. I ask unanimous consent that written statements from the Department of Defense and the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce be included in the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. I finally ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on any bills under consideration this afternoon. Without objection, where's my gavel? Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is adjourned. Have a great weekend.